So the point of this video is to kind of tie together various aspects of what we've been doing. And I've been doing this in class all along, but this is the first video that's dedicated to tying things together. So let's start with the first day of class. We talked about the view that philosophy of language is central to philosophy, maybe even the center of philosophy, because all philosophical truths are analytic. If a truth is analytic, then it's made true by its meaning. If it's made true by its meaning, then you can access its truth value by reflecting on its meaning. So the central philosophical method is to reflect on meaning. Therefore, philosophy of language is at the center of philosophy, because that's reflecting on meaning is something that when you're doing it, you're doing philosophy of language. Another view holds that philosophical problems just dissolve through philosophical analysis, and that is analysis of the meanings of the expressions that seem to create the problems. Another view is that philosophy should identify meanings in order to set the stage for science. That is, it should say what various scientific propositions mean. Let's start with this claim that philosophical truths are analytic. Perceptual experiences can't give one reason to prefer one philosophical proposition to another. So recall Emma here. We ask, is she necessarily or merely contingently 62 inches tall? The world would look the same whether she were necessarily or merely contingently 62 inches tall. Either way, you'd measure her at 62 inches. So observation can't tell you whether this feature of her is a necessary feature or a merely contingent feature. Did Emma necessarily or merely contingently die in 1940? Same thing. Observation can't tell you whether that was a necessary or contingent feature. Was Emma's urging people not to register for the draft in 1917 morally good or morally bad? Again, you can't tell just by looking. You can't observe the moral goodness or moral badness. Was jailing Emma for the activity in 1917 and then deporting her to Russia in 1919 morally bad? Again, you can't tell just by looking. You need to reason, you need to have some other kind of evidence. Let's look at another kind of case where it looks like we have knowledge that outstrips what we can observe. So remember the principle we called the indiscernibility of identicals. It says for any two things, x and y, if they're identical, then they share all their features. After all, if they're identical, then there's just one thing there. So of course, if one has a feature, the other does, because it's the same thing. This contrasts with the principle called the identity of indiscernibles, which says for any two things, x and y, if they share all their features, then they're identical. One of these may be called Leibniz's law, but I don't really care. For us, what matters is we're interested in the first one, the indiscernibility of identicals. Now, here we have a statue of Noam Chomsky. We can ask a question. On Monday, let's suppose that we name this bit of matter, this bit of clay, lumpy. When we name it, we don't care that it's arranged in this particular way. We allow that lumpy could be, if you roll lumpy into a ball or flatten lumpy like a pancake, it's still lumpy. By contrast, it looks like Noam Chomsky is named such that it names this matter arranged in this particular way. So this raises a question on Tuesday here, is there one object or two? And no amount of observing is going to answer that question. You're going to need to use reason to decide whether lumpy and Noam Chomsky are distinct objects or the same object. Okay, so perceptual experience can't give us reason to prefer one philosophical proposition to another, at least when we're talking about necessity versus contingency, morality, claims like whether there can be coincidence objects like lumpy and Noam Chomsky or not. The lesson here is that any philosophical proposition that can be known a priori, independent of experience. How might that work? Well, suppose we have someone say, is Joe's sister male or female? You just close your eyes and you think about it and you answer female. It's a priori. Is Emma necessarily 62 inches tall? The idea is you just close your eyes and think about it and you answer no. Was her trying to prevent the draft registration immoral? You just close your eyes and you think about it and you answer no, at least if you're historically informed. My view is you answer no. You might disagree. Okay, but how can one know anything a priori? Well, here we have two people, and one says, we learn about the world through perceptual experience. How could anyone learn about the world just by thinking without looking? And the other says, if a proposition is true, or a statement, it should say, is true in virtue of its meaning alone, that is analytic, then anyone who understands it can check it's true without checking the world just by thinking about it, just by reflecting on what it means. So, for example, if I know that Joe has a sister, then I know that he has a sibling, and I know this because all sisters or siblings is analytic. It's made true by its meaning alone. So here's an easy answer. If a proposition is true, or a statement, it should say, is true in virtue of its meaning alone, that is, it's analytic, then anyone who understands it can know it's true without checking the world to see if it's true. Now, let's just grant that no other kind of proposition can be a priori, and we get this lesson that any philosophical proposition that can be known is analytic. So this is the idea that philosophical truths are analytic. What about the idea that philosophical problems dissolve through analysis? Well, take the nothing nothings. This seems to create deep problems about what the nothing is, but Carnap shows us that when you analyze this correctly, you realize it's an illegitimate attempt to put nothing into subject position, when in fact it should be in effect in quantifier position. Similar point, Pegasus doesn't exist, seems to create a problem. What would make this sentence true? Well, it would be Pegasus having the property of not existing. Since that sentence in general is true if the subject of the sentence has or doesn't have the property being attributed to it, depending on whether the property is attributed or its negation is attributed. So it looks like Pegasus must exist if Pegasus doesn't exist, but of course Pegasus exists if Pegasus exists, so it looks like Pegasus necessarily exists. That's weird. Solution, treat Pegasus as a predicate and treat existence not as a property but as a quantifier. So the idea is we're getting rid of these philosophical problems just by thinking about what they mean. Similarly, I have a pain suggests that there's an object of pain that you have, which raises the question, how does that pain relate to the brain, the body, and so on and so forth? And the idea goes, a correct analysis of this sentence doesn't have pain in a object position, but rather just says this is equivalent to saying, wah, or I'm unhappy, or something like that. It's just expressing a negative feeling. And so it doesn't imply that there is an object of pain, which invites the question, how does that object relate to other things? The idea is that I have a pain is as nonsensical as the square root of strawberry. The square root of strawberry looks like it's syntactically well-formed, like it has the same syntax as the square root of 9, but there's a category mistake. A strawberry isn't the kind of thing that can have a square root, and a pain isn't the kind of thing that you can have. Not an object that you can have. Finally, philosophy should identify meaning for science. The idea here is that the goal of philosophy is to figure out what scientific propositions or scientific statements mean, and the verificationist view is one explanation of what scientific statements mean. There's other possibilities. Okay. I already talked through these, so they don't need to be bolded. Okay. Now there's a question. How does all of that relate to the sudden shift to metaphysics, the sudden shift to asking questions about what exists and what grounds what? And we'll take that question up in the next video.